Okay, folks are like trickling in, and we'll give folks a couple more minutes and then start. Okay, welcome everybody. This is Aries' last CE of this season, and we're really excited because we had a lot of really great webinars, and then we had one in-person rescue workshop that was a big success. And you can always find these webinars on our YouTube channel, which I can drop in the chat if you guys want to copy and paste it over. And today we have what does it mean to operationally manage risk? And I'm Brooke Rutherford, Aries Operations Director, and I am excited to welcome Anne St. Clair, Josh Cole, our Aries Technical Director, Steve Conger, and then Liz Briggs-Meter, our Education Director, is going to be monitoring it. Okay, this webinar is being recorded. So by staying on the line, you consent to participate in a recorded session. If only your name and voice will appear if you ask questions. And again, we'll be posting this to the YouTube channel at the end of the season. If you all can just hold on to your questions and you can drop them in the chat in the Q&A feature, then we'll leave time at the end, about 20 minutes, to answer questions. So you can either hold on to them or drop them in the chat as they come up, and we'll sort through them at the end. So without further ado, I will stop sharing my screen and I'll hand it over to Liz.
Great. Thanks, Brooke. And thank you, Anne, Steve, and Josh, for joining us this evening for what I hope is a rich conversation about managing risk, not in an individual, in the moment situation, but when you start backing out and looking at a whole operation, looking at the structures and the culture, and kind of the like bigger umbrella pieces that go into managing risk. So to start us off, Anne, well, actually, and all of you, but we'll start with Anne. I lost my question. Tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your career arc as it's related to operational risk management. What context have you worked in, and what parallel or fields or communities do you draw from in your work?
Thank you, Liz. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss this topic today. I think the best way to give an introduction for a community I'm deeply passionate about is the social science community. And I got bit by that bug early in my education and my undergraduate work, really curious about how people understand their environments. And after graduating, I knew I also had a deep passion for the backcountry, and I had an early chapter in terms of my operational experience as a mountain bike guide, which merged into some backcountry ski guiding as well as education. And that took the first decade of my career was really in those guiding industries and education industries. And then I looped back to that foundational education that I had, wanting to merge the two more in depth. So I conducted my master's degree in Canada with the Simon Fraser University Avalanche Research Program that is led by Dr. Pascal Hagley. And that kicked off a whole research trajectory that I'm still embedded in. I'm currently still working with that research group as a PhD student and engaging in these types of questions. So that'll be a lot of what I speak about today. I'm still involved in guiding and education work for our industry, as well as I had a stint in Canada working as a public avalanche forecaster too. So there's a bit of that within my personal experience as well.
So drawing from a whole bunch of different places. Thank you so much,
Yeah.
Anne. And Steve, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Oh, well, I live in Canada, in Golden, Canada, British Columbia, headwaters of the beautiful Columbia River, where it's still free flowing. And I began my avalanche career the last time the conditions were this bad. My professional career began the winter of 76, 77. And I've worked in a lot of aspects, ski patrolling, education, fair amount of time as a highways and industrial consultant, as well as just a straight avalanche consultant who does, avalanche hazard risk assessments and operating plans. I've, been a backcountry lodge operator, and what else can I tell you? Basically managed risk operationally for most of my career.
Great. Thanks so much, Steve. And last but not least, Josh.
Hey, so I came into the industry doing outdoor education and working as a ski patroller, domestically and abroad as well. And I have sort of progressed in various ways. And now I'm a guide service owner. I work full time as a guide, and I work on the AMGA's instructor team and as a pro trainer for ARI. And then I think probably the most directly related to this panel is I work as a risk management consultant for experiential consulting. And so we go into lots of different organizations from tiny to quite big, and do various types of auditing and sort of resource creation and help these organizations sort of assess their risk management systems and build robustness therein. So I do a bit of that now, and I am glad to be here.
Great. Thanks so much, Josh. I'm trying to adjust here. Please let Brooke know if you cannot hear me. I've gotten some feedback that maybe my mic, and maybe the panelists can tell me, can you all hear me okay? Okay, I'll lean in a little more. Great. Well, it's important. I'll speak up. So Josh, we'll stick with you just since your voice is already all warmed up, but tell us a little bit about your approach or philosophy around operational risk management. So to you, the question of like, how is personal risk management and operational risk management different?
I guess I would say that I tried to have them not be wildly different in terms of the process, but the operational risk band is pretty different, personally versus operationally. And maybe the scale of the process is a little bit different. So where like a concrete example of that for me is that debriefing occurs, both at the personal level and at the operational level, but, it might be on the tailgate with a beer personally, and it's in a much more formalized and repeatable fashion, operationally speaking. And I think the reason that I'm passionate about having that parallel is that I think it's ultimately like the organization's risk management. You can have all the best forms and all the most advanced technology in the world, but it's really the organization's culture that determines whether the risk management approach is effective or not. And so I try and make sure that parallel between my personal life, my personal recreation, and my professional life exists, because I think that that's one of the ways that I build culture in the organizations that I work at is by creating that parallel.
Great. I have a follow-up for you, and then I'm interested to hear from others, and I'll kind of leave it open to that. But this concept of operational risk band, and I'm curious, this is actually maybe for any of you, while that process, like that there is some upper and lower bounds of like our personal risk tolerance, is that a useful concept, or do you think like is there a disconnect in terms of theoretically that process is the same, but personally, like basically do individuals who are not professional risk managers think in terms of what their acceptable risk band is? And we can talk now that we're like post-pandemic times or in pandemic times, whatever, that we all did take like a shot at being professional risk managers. Maybe people's fluency with that vocabulary is there, but I'm curious what any of you think about that. I guess for the like lay person, the process looks the same, but what does that maybe is it the vocabulary that's different, or is there an unconsciousness about actually engaging with that structure?
I'll take a start at it. I think operational risk band is just the terminology, the phrase that we use in our sector, our avalanche sector. Dave McClung gave it to us in the avalanche handbook and his papers, but it's kind of has its roots in a different perspective on risk. I mean, everybody has an operational risk band and a personal risk band. How much money are you willing to put into Tesla stock? It's all based on whether, what uncertainties are associated with that. And if the uncertainties are acceptable, then you let your money ride. If you're at the craps table, if you're at the roulette table, if you put your money on red, if the uncertainty is acceptable for what you can lose or gain, then, that's within your operational risk band. And that's because, and that kind of found its grounding in, the early 2000s, after the 2008 crash, when the risk management world started looking at how do we talk about risk, because it's both something for the good. There's a positive outcome of risk and there's a negative outcome of risk, and that's where the unified definition of risk is the effect of uncertainty on your objectives came from. So I think that everybody has an operational risk band or a personal risk band. What are you willing to risk to get what you want? So
I guess I would just respond in to that a little bit and say that, I think what Steve said that I would like to highlight is that risk has positive and negatives that are potentials with that uncertainty. And I think our society, one of the reasons that we have not very good risk literacy is that the way our society tends to talk about risk is something to be mitigated. Like the very term risk tolerance, it's like how much risk can we tolerate in whatever we're doing? And it is one that is very much focused on the negative impacts of risk. And I think that, in the pandemic, one of the things that came out was like some of the risks were worth it because it allowed us to like see our family. And some of the risks were not worth it because it didn't provide any real benefit and it added some danger. And so I think that, what I would like to see our community do is move to a much more holistic sense of risk, and not just mitigating or eliminating risk, but how do we leverage all the good things that are happening instead of just focusing on the bad things that we want to get rid of.
Thanks, Josh. And we're going to come back to this, I guess, the upside of risk, or the, throw it out there that you'll probably talk about this safety differently. But I would love to, before we continue down that rabbit hole, I'd love to hear from Anne, and if you have any additional thoughts on this. because I'm certain you do.
I do, yeah. And I think just to maybe piggyback and repeat some of the ideas here, I think the idea of the operational wristband helps us to put terms that help us with making the implicit or these invisible structures that are at play in this type of decision making and make them a little more explicit for people, and help to guide them in how these things truly are a part of the ways in which we make decisions. So I think it's helpful, and it applies from across operations to individuals. To go to your first question, I wanted to make the focus of how we manage risk as people versus when we're at work around this question of how are we learning about what we're doing. And I think for me as a person, you know, a lot of what I've learned over the years in doing this type of work and going ski touring for myself as a backcountry skier is I think about a lot of the experiences I've had, the people in my life and those relationships. And it's very much a product of my experiences out there and doing these things. And then when I think about operational risk management, I think similarly about how our industry has learned and how the broader risk management conversation has been learning over time about what's going on and ways that we can get better, and the ideas that we started with that have iterated and evolved. And I like to look at those processes and see them in a bit more detail, both organizationally and as an industry and as a body of research, and then also me as a person. Yeah, so just wanted to throw that in there.
Yeah, the educator in me, my ears perked up at the learning aspect of this. And it's something that I think about a lot in terms of like learning organizations and that being part of the suite of tools that you have operationally managing risk. And I imagine that for all of us here and probably everyone that's in the webinar, we are where we are as backcountry travelers in part because we built community and friendships and mentor type relationships that emulated the structures that are in, like, we'll call them robust workplaces, to like structurally facilitate that learning. I'm going way out on a limb, somehow trying to bring these two ideas together to Josh's idea of like the upside of risk, and they may not come together, but I'm interested in this like aspect of operational risk management also being like operationally structuring our learning. And I'm wondering if Josh, well, both Steve and Josh, you both like own businesses, but I'm gonna look to Josh because I think you have a larger staff you manage now. I'm sort of curious about that learning aspect, I guess, of risk management and like what that looks like in your operation in terms of what you structure to support your staff.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Just to make it concrete, like, one of our focuses in terms of building capacity, positive capacities in our business around managing risk is to really focus on either whether you want to call them near misses or free lessons or whatever the terminology you want to use, but basically events that happen where it could have gone bad, but out of sheer luck or some whatever, some sort of event didn't wind up becoming catastrophic. And really, so like at the beginning of each of our seasons, we actually get together in person as a staff and we review incidents and near misses. And one of the ways that we try to build culture around that is that typically it's the owners, the bosses, those of us in charge that go first and try to demonstrate as best as we can a sense you know, of being open and honest and willing to go to these places that are, you know, sort of vulnerable, where you're admitting error, as an example to our staff. And when they do the same, we, you know, whether that's at the beginning of the season during a formal setting or during the season, like we'll disseminate those kinds of incident reports or near miss reports, and really like try to congratulate the staff person for having done that, you know, taken that step and shown that. So like that's one, like I would say very small, but that has been very successful for us at creating culture where you know, near miss reporting is congratulated, is part of the culture, is expected. It's not, you don't get fired because you messed something up. And coming from a ski patrol background, you know, back in the day, I know a lot of ski patrols are really actively moving away from this kind of culture. Like if you messed up when I started out, it was like the thing to do was to hide it and never talk about it again. And you know, I think we're working pretty hard in our industry to change that culture. And I think that is a big positive because it allows our organizations to learn.
Yeah, thanks. Steve, I'd love to know your thoughts on that. I think, particularly as a consultant, where you're coming into an organization and trying to set up structures versus like, I own this place and so I can just like set the tone.
Yeah, I think that what's important is, and this is also from an educational standpoint, because as you go into an organization, it's all about education both ways, you know, understanding both the you know, the personal perspectives of the workers and the core, you know, the company perspectives. And to get around that, we just have to throw the word risk out, because you know, in any, you know, anything about, you know, when we talk about risk, we have to start out with a definition of risk we can all agree on so we can get any further. So if we just throw the word risk out and instead we talk about uncertainties and consequences, then it starts to become understandable, you know, on every aspect. So you may have a client who is risk averse. Like, you know, we operate our avalanche education schools in a very risk adverse environment. But if you are, you know, going in to do avalanche control work for a mine, and these, you know, the workers there are used to all the hazards of underground mining, you know, running across an avalanche path is not, you know, it's not on their radar as a risk. You know, there's, you know, the consequences of their everyday job and their everyday mistakes are far higher. So it's an understanding. It's, you know, standing at a highway closure and, you know, having your own personal awareness of that it's okay for somebody to yell at you because the alternative is not, that's not acceptable. And you know, you've got Whiskey Jack, you know, logger that just came out of the Beaverfoot and he's punched through 3 sloughs on the road and now he's on the highway and can't understand why, you know, he can't continue down the highway. And it's like, well, because if it was just you, you know, you could, but see that car over there, they haven't got a clue what they're doing. And I can't let them down the road. So it comes down to really, you know, an understanding at all the levels, whether it's, you know, recreational, educational, or industrial, it's uncertainty and consequences. And you really don't have any leg to stand on as an operation or a, you know, until you acknowledge what the consequences are of the business you're running, you know, acknowledging what it means that you know, well, I can put it in terms of you know, of an early climbing friend of mine had a steel erection business, and you know, they have the highest, you know, OSHA rate of any business, and he knew that, you know, someday he would have a job site fatality. It was just simply a matter of time for that industry, and I think he went 18 or 20 years before he had, you know, a job site fatality. But he, you know, when he started his business, he knew that was going to happen someday. There was no question about it. So when we talk about it, we need to think about how we, how we educate people, how, you know, um, we've been having a conversation about how do you teach about consequence. And it's really, you can't teach consequence. People have to experience consequence. The closest thing I've come to is, this little exercise, and kids, don't try this at home. But, get yourself a nice piece of wood. Get yourself a nice knife. And does everybody know the rules of 5-finger fillet? Ah. I just saw, Anne's eyes, lit up. And when you do that with a group, some people are thinking, oh yeah, I got this. I can risk manage this. I can, or I can't believe this person that is supposed to know what they're talking about is talking about, getting a knife out and playing 5-finger fillet. But it's visceral. You can't. You've got to figure out how to convey consequences, and then get into really the 4 things we do with uncertainty. So I hope that answers the question, Liz. I went off on a tangent there.
Yeah, you guys are gonna challenge me to, for the participants here, I had said, I'm gonna try really hard to be the one who brings it back to the concrete. And I think Josh is winning that game right now, because I'm definitely about to take this into the weeds. But this is a great conversation, but what I hear a little bit is like, okay, so we're not going to talk about risk. We're going to talk about let's speak more plainly about uncertainty and consequences. But like, consequence is still a subjective term, right? It's a perception of like what's at risk is it's a values judgment. And I have a question in here, but I see Anne's eyebrows waggling, and that maybe I don't have to form this question and she'll take the baton. But I'm curious about this. Like, are we just like when we try to bring this to, okay, we're saying like we need greater risk literacy or maybe fluency with the vocabulary, switching out one term for another still leaves us in the same, like, we're not all talking about the same thing, perhaps when we're having conversations about risk.
Yeah, if I could maybe step in here from a few things that I'm hearing that I want to build upon. And Steve made some really great points about how the term that I like to always zoom in on is the term context. And I heard Steve talking about that with some of the different examples he gave, is that people are working in different contexts, operating in different contexts, and may see things differently. And then where Steve went was like, how do we help people really understand the consequences of those environments? And first, we have to understand, I'm going to back up, we have to understand their contexts and how they're different. And when I do the zoom out activity that I mentioned before of looking at like how our industry has been learning over time and where we stand in our understanding of all these different risk management contexts that are part of our industry. The public is one. Guiding is another, public forecasting for industries. They are all very vastly different contexts, and there's so many different contexts among our public in which people are operating. And fundamentally, we have not kept up in our establishing approaches scientifically that help us to understand context. This is a huge gap that I see in our research and our practice as an industry, that we just don't have the foundations to really hone in and separate and differentiate and pinpoint what important differences are in context and how they play a role, and then how then we can best support and facilitate risk management in those contexts, whether that be a deeper understanding of consequence or whatever that may look like. But that's really the work that I'm super invested in my doctoral program, is operationalizing, making it so that we can work with context and do something with it that's constructive, because at this point it is the great unknown. And our approach so far as an industry has been taking our best stab at it and crossing our fingers and hoping it works. And I think without having evidence-based rigorous studies to draw from, my like loose analysis is I think it likely works for some and it likely does not work for others. And that's where I think we can do better in terms of like how we can learn as an industry about risk management, is getting to know people's contexts in more detail. And so to summarize it, my big take home is we need to ask, and we need to get better at asking what people see their contexts, how they see them, and what's at stake. Yeah. Okay.
Who are some of the, and I think that's really interesting, I'm zeroing in on the part where you say like, what works has been working for this group, but probably not working for others. And we may like not even know that we don't know about them in some ways. So I'm curious, like with your work, if you like, what are some examples of like who we know, who we
Yes.
are aware of that we're not serving, or maybe that what has worked for us is not working for them?
Yeah, thanks for asking. And the first answer is I don't know, because we're not very good at collecting that data. So a little bit of a poke at our industry as a whole of like, what data do we think is important and what are we tracking? I don't think we have the picture where I can stand here with confidence and say, yeah, this is who we're missing. I think we're missing a lot. But I think from what we might be able to pull from some of our data is in seeing some of the trends among our most committed backcountry recreationists. Like there are larger numbers now of people exposing themselves to avalanche terrain, we think. And potentially like some ideas out there are that potentially more people are exposing themselves with less incident. That's all conjecture. We don't have numbers around that. But what I do think is interesting and where I'm curious, again, I have no good data to support this, but where I'm curious is in other communities, like, for example, ice climbing communities, snowshoe communities. The data I do have that I can draw from is in some of the research I've done where I've sat down and interviewed members of these groups. And a common and very prominent theme in those discussions is this theme of not belonging to the public avalanche safety products that exist. So they don't feel that the public avalanche forecast or public avalanche education really applies to them. And that's just a small theme from a handful of preliminary studies, and there's a lot more to explore there. But I do think kind of the individual that is outside of what you might see as like the marketable backcountry traveler, like standard norm, is not really that invested in our system of risk management products and programs.
Thanks, Anne. So it's been, I might lean on Josh again to bring us back to the concrete. Can maybe then like sticking with the recreational audience, it's hard because we are talking sort of at two levels where we're saying, what do we do as professionals in our professional community operationally? But then we're also like, how does that transfer, whether we are teaching or actually managing risk for that recreational general public audience? And you use the word community and this like feeling of belonging. So let's take, for example, let's say ice climbers. There's a little bit of like translation that they could do from, say, like a public advisory that would, maybe talk about a storm slab problem. And so there's kind of this like inference they could make about loose problems. but that's not going to be explicitly forecasted, but that is very relevant in the like highly like consequential terrain, trappy terrain that they're in. And so that might be maybe a matter of education, or that might be a matter of, you know, simply changing the messaging. So where I'm going with this question is maybe thinking more about this, like, community aspect, and maybe I'm just going to fully punt to Josh to explain this. Like, instead of the individual getting something, we're talking more about building culture, maybe. And I might be putting words in your mouth and saying what I think it is, but I'm interested in this community aspect and like the talking to others outside of, since I think we're all skiers here on this panel, you know, how we're talking to people outside of like people sliding around downhill on snow.
I mean, as someone, I mean, I'm a ice climber. I'm also a motorized winter recreationalist, both professionally and for fun. And obviously as, a more traditional skier kind of focused winter recreationalist as well. And ultimately, I think that, I think the idea of culture that ties those together is correct. Like, I think overarchingly, like the thing that ARI or really any of the educators within the industry can do is to work, like that level one instructor really has the best ability to build culture in the community of recreationalists. I think they have a better ability to do that than the further you get up than like, for instance, a forecaster running a forecast center, because they're in touch with these people as they're beginning their foray into these activities. And so I think there is a better opportunity to build culture than we might think there is, because there are new backcountry users coming to ARI and coming to all the other providers looking for direction. Like, we have the opportunity to do a little bit of culture building with every single level one and every single level two and every single rescue course that occurs. And I think the mechanism by which we can engage these various user communities is less about the product that is produced by forecast centers and more about the ways in which we build culture. And so, like, one example of that is like sliding on snow. Like, well, a lot of people that are using these products are actually, they're motoring on snow or whatever. Not to get pedantic around the lingo, but I do think that there's this, like, what I see in my local community, to make this a little bit more specific, is that we have all these snowmobilers that are snowmobiling for fun. We have all these skiers that are going skiing, and the way they're getting to their skiing is with snowmobiles. And I've had all these great conversations out in the field where you're like standing around some broken snowmobile saying like, I don't know how to fix this. And then the snowmobilers come along and they're like, oh yeah, yeah. And they're pulling it apart and helping you put your belt on. And like those little instances where communities are coming together, but instead of like having the user groups be in conflict, it's actually like this kind of a building of esprit de corps, can be really powerful. Like, those are like little things. And so that happen to an individual. And so I wonder, what role can ARI and the avalanche education industry take in sort of promoting that building of culture and that connection between different user groups at that introductory level, so that when those people do go out into the field, the skiers and the ice climbers and the snowmobilers like are having they're more likely to have an interaction that is collaborative, as opposed to one where they're arguing or grasping at an implied scarce resource or something along those lines. I don't have a great answer for that, but I do think that there is like a real opportunity there for those folks that are educating these newer users.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting thought experiment of like, is teaching this risk management process, for ARI courses and the ARI framework, is that really the right method versus maybe there is something that's more effective in terms of building culture and community that is bringing groups together. I don't know what the specifics there, but I think that's kind of an interesting thought of like maybe there's actually a different approach with what we should be doing with our education. Steve, you had some thoughts?
Well, I was just going to bring it back to ground it that I don't think there's much difference between operational risk management and personal risk management. They're both rely on self-reflection, on really understanding what you're willing to risk. What consequences, at what likelihood are you willing to put yourself in front of? Are you, as an organization, are you willing to spend 12% of your operating budget to do avalanche control? Or are you willing to break even this year because it's a really difficult year to operate and your reputation is far more important than anything? If you just get through this season successfully operating, then that's a far better outcome. We do, and that's where, in an operation, it's always quite different. Ours is, on a haul road, is it, how long of a shutdown on the haul road is it acceptable in impacting the production and the costs and the values that are happening? We do the same thing recreationally. We make a decision of, how big of a hit are we going to, of laughing gas are we going to take to feel good by picking our line, whatever method we're using. And so with our recreational method that we're teaching is we're teaching people, we're giving people tools to filter the human effects on that risk decision making. And the other part is really, thinking about, okay, what is it that makes you individually tick? What is your bottom line? Friend of mine told me that, he was having this discussion and somebody told him the question is, who am I skiing for today, me or my two kids? That person actually has a picture of their kid on their ski. So that's where I think we lack in our educational method for recreationists is really helping them understand that human factor side of, we're doing a good job of, describing the pitfalls that affect our decision making, but where do we teach them how to weigh the advantages of what they're doing? I'm sure there are athletes that have a far higher risk tolerance than a recreationist. There are businesses that have far higher risk tolerances than other businesses. So that's the missing component, I think, is we all manage risk the same way. We figure out how to, what do we want to mitigate to bring it back into being acceptable with what we don't know, or we just jump in and don't care.
I'm hearing everyone talk around maybe an inadequate vocabulary for having like the real conversations that we need to have about this, that like we talk about, this is kind of funny because I say this and I think several area instructors say this, that like really probably the most helpful thing to happen on a course is just like group therapy, or not happen on a course, but the thing that's going to help you be like the best, most effective backcountry traveler and like managing risk is just group therapy, like the ability to communicate and like have self-awareness, name what you're feeling and what's going on for you, and like facilitate a realistic conversation with others. And I'm hearing themes of that in here, that we perhaps don't have the right tools personally or in a personal context to like have the or like to prompt that kind of reflection and self-awareness. And perhaps the context difference is that some of that is there because in a professional context, because an operation is defining the, you know, what's at risk, uh, what's the upside, what's acceptable, unacceptable, and we don't carry that over. We're not teaching people to do that personally. Again, I'm just throwing out comments now without questions, but that is what I'm hearing a little bit. I'd love to, I don't know, like what tools have you all used to teach that to professionals or non-professionals?
Part of that is is through case narratives and looking for where the opportunities are, the mistakes, or because there are always going to be mistakes, but there are also, systematic problems. Actually sitting down and thinking about what are the adverse events that will affect what we want. What are the adverse event, what are, just from across the board, what are the adverse events that would affect our business? And are we adequately training, preparing for them? Or, a robust organization has is obsessed with failure. They look at all the pieces of failing, that really understanding what could go wrong so that you're not blind to it is really important.
Josh, I'm wondering if you have thoughts countering that, like that a robust organization is obsessed with failure. Because I feel like you and the other Steve Smith might say that's actually that we should be obsessed with, I don't know, something else. Maybe there shouldn't be obsession.
Yeah, I'll resist the urge to like fully jump on top of the soapbox as well as I can, but if you look at the much broader industry, like if you look at aerospace, if you look at the military, like they're really moving away or trying to move away, healthcare, from that sort of traditional safety model where someone is to blame for the mess up and we're going to hold them accountable, fire them, retrain them, whatever it might be, or a system is to blame and we're going to change that system and we're going to sort of mediate this from the top down, and we need to track everything that goes wrong. And we know we're successful when we have 0 day, or whatever, 42 days since our last significant incident, that poster up on the wall. As an example, like that kind of safety cheerleading, like we made it 42 days since our last serious incident, or we're going to try to have 0 avalanche deaths this season, has been shown time and time again to actually increase bad outcomes in organizations when you have that kind of safety cheerleading. And so like the where I would like to see our industry move towards is this, very well researched and very well established safety differently model that's in all these much larger industries where safety is something that is a responsibility for managers to take from the top down. Like I am responsible for my employees and it is my responsibility to help them, reduce the likelihood of bad things happening. And the way I'm going to do that is by recognizing that they're the solution. Like people in our organizations are the solution. They're not the problem. And we want to recognize, like, we want to spend more time thinking about like, what are our capacities in our organizations than what could possibly go wrong. Right. So if you like, think about all these events with Boeing where like a door, fell off an Alaska Airlines flight. And if you read the media reports and you look at sort of the general way we're looking at this, it's like, oh, some dude in Renton didn't screw those bolts on correctly. And reality, and you're like, that person should get fired and their manager should get fired. And that's like a very reactive, it's not a very useful lens to look at actually making it less likely that doors fall off airplanes. Like the things that we need to recognize is like, prior to that incident happening, multiple employees at Alaska Airlines and at Boeing were like raising the alarm, like, hey, we heard weird noises in this airplane on the last flight. And hey, we're moving too quickly on the line in Renton, putting bolts into doors on planes. And, when I came to my boss and said that we're moving too quickly, I just got yelled at and told to go back to work. Like, so, right, there's we need to recognize, like, those people, like that person that heard the noise on the airplane on the previous flight, and that person on the assembly line in Renton that was raising the red flag. Like, that's how if we just empower those people, we're less likely to have these bad things happen. So instead of focusing on like elimination of bad outcomes, I think it's a lot more useful to focus on the positive capacities in our organizations. Like, why are things going well almost all the time, as opposed to why do they go wrong once in a while?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic response, and I love the direction that this is taking, that the prompts and the questions we should be investigating is why does this make sense for people, and seeing all the interactions in our system and the feedback as an opportunity to learn. And so I think one of the reasons we've been so focused on failure, like, we need to acknowledge our context is that it is a wicked learning environment, and we get so little feedback from the natural hazard environment that exists. So therefore, as a product of that, in our system, in our context, we are so much more dependent on the feedback from each other and from ourselves. And so Steve's comment about being self-reflective as having benefit holds true when we look at our context, that we don't get reliable feedback from the environment. Therefore, perhaps we can get more reliable feedback from ourselves, and that could work. However, one of the things I want to make clear is that what we're dancing around here too is that we need evidence about what works. And so far, we just don't have, again, like the structures and the fundamentals in place to really separate context and be able to demonstrate that something is in fact effective towards improving risk management in this context. So to be a bit challenging, perhaps self-reflection does not work for everyone. If you're someone that works 3 jobs, has 4 children under your care, and tries to go snowshoeing twice every 6 years, perhaps that experience for you is really to avoid risk at all costs and to eliminate the need for self-reflection on your entire risk management process, because there's just not that capacity for you. And so your approach is very different. Like, I want to go to the internet and I want to see where I can go snowshoeing, where I don't need to manage avalanche risk at all. And I want more certainty. And I don't want my life's experiences and a lot of time and effort made into making decisions. So I think what works for some might not work for others. And therefore, our focus needs to be where do things work and why, and really trying to come to an understanding of what these variables are and how they interact and how they serve as feedback that helps us learn or not.
Thanks, Dan. What I'm hearing too is, this whole conversation is around operational, thus sort of implying professional, risk management. And you're really talking about, I think that trap we can get caught in with, like, well, it works for the pros, so it flows down the system and must work for a recreational traveler. And I think it's worth, reinforcing that point of, I think being a person who maybe I feel like I identify more with probably our target recreational audience, and that I have a child, we both work. The child doesn't work, sorry, my partner and I work. very full day of work. It was a very full, like managing all the baloney that goes in school. Like I have a PTA meeting 20 minutes after this webinar, like all those things going on. And I get to Saturday and I'm like, dear God, I'm just like excited that I have pants that I like put my top on and it doesn't totally reek, and maybe that I did laundry. And like thinking about all of that, like it's very hard to sort of like show up and like I like want 2 days of the week that I can shed my professional obligations, that I can kind of like turn off my brain. Again, because of my professional background, I recognize like I'm going to ski in bounds today because that's about all I have the bandwidth for. So I think there's this interesting, I guess where I'm going with this is to take us back to the professional context, because I don't want to lose this thread of what Josh is saying about sort of look at capacity building in order to catch us doing the right thing more, and like emphasizing on that. But then with that caveat of like, that does not necessarily transfer all the way down the line. The context changes significantly. So it's like the pro model doesn't necessarily work all the way down into a like to the recreational user. So I would like to pull us back up into like the professional end of the line or end of the spectrum, in part because I'd love to talk a little bit more about this sort of I don't know, I guess capacity building and just like what that looks like operationally. You know, like I think I had envisioned we were going to talk a lot about wristbands and all of that, but I think this might actually be a more fascinating conversation of like a new lens to approach our work professionally as risk managers, in terms of it's not just simply talking about the element at risk and how we manage the uncertainty around like avoiding negative consequences, but like actually capitalizing on this opportunity as a learning organization, as a self-aware organization, to catch ourselves doing the right thing, because we operate in this wicked environment that really relies on like other sort of forms of feedback that we aren't going to get directly from the environment around us. So that might be going back to Josh, or if anyone else, about ideas around that of like, okay, where are we moving professionally as we think about evolving how we operationally manage risk?
Well, we're defining our operational risk band, and I hope this tries to answer a couple of the questions that have come up so far. You know, by saying that you know the situation that you just described, your weekend, and what Ann just described as, you know, the mother that wants to go snowshoeing twice a year, you know, are we saying that that behavior is inside the operational risk band of a forecast center or an educational? So we're actually saying that we are going to build our resources to address that person that goes snowshoeing twice a year and has all these other things, or is to talk about our definition of acceptable uncertainty. Is that person, do they represent, you know, 1/100th of a probability of somebody actually going out and getting killed in an avalanche? And are we going to spend a lot of our resources going after that big of an operational risk band, or you know, so just putting some real, you know, examples of when we talk about an operational risk band, you know, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about what do we want to affect and change in terms of operational risk or personal risk.
Yeah, I think perhaps that was not the best example to use because it seems like it maybe sidetracked the thinking a little bit, but I'll try to reposition it in the operational landscape. But yeah, contexts are very different across our industry as well. So if you're making risk management decisions for whether an avalanche can cross the double yellow versus a heli ski operation, or international backcountry guiding, those contexts are all very different. And the point I was trying to make is that the risk management solution in those contexts may differ and would need to be evidence-based based on the context in order for us to move forward as an industry, is to look for the evidence that shows us that something is actually working in the context. And so to give us an example is the traditional use of the strategic mindset that came into wide use in our industry, that came from a day-to-day operational context where the same group, a tight-knit group of guides, is interacting in the same terrain day in and day out. And it gave them this shared communication tool that was correlated with a terrain use pattern. And then our industry, with pros and cons, it's just reflecting on how our industry learns, then thought, this seems to work there. Let's broaden it to any and all other contexts and see if it would also work, which there can be value in that. But it didn't acknowledge the true context in which that tool was developed and where its limitations may be in other contexts. And that's what I'm trying to get to, is really being specific about the environments and the system and the relationships and feedbacks in which something works, and gathering that evidence and trying to be more specific before we are proposing things that may work in other contexts. So as a public avalanche forecaster, the strategic mindset just didn't work because I was always going somewhere new and had no terrain familiarity, and other tools and communication proved more effective.
Thanks, Anne. Josh, I'd seen you unmute your mic, but I didn't know if you had additional comments.
I just want to, think a little bit, during this conversation, I've thought we keep throwing around this idea of the wicked learning environment. And I think we can all agree that the vast majority of people go out and recreate in avalanche terrain. They come back having had a good day, or maybe an okay day, and everything goes fine. And we consider that to be, like, I think that one of the undercurrents I want to bring out is that when we talk about the wicked learning environment, we often say, oh, that was luck, right? But in reality, I think we need to highlight the fact that when people go out and they have a positive outcome, that there is luck, and there are also all these other positive surprises, like their positive capacities accounted for some portion of that. We don't really understand how much of it is luck and how much did they do the right thing. But just because nothing bad happened doesn't mean that they did bad things but were lucky. It means they did, and this is true of everyone going out professionally or recreationally, we do some things that are not so good. We do some things that are really good. We do a lot of things in the middle, and we have an outcome. And it's way more confusing and gray to actually go through all those times where things go well or okay, because it's really hard to pick out like what were the good things and what were the bad things, no matter how good our debrief system is. And so I think, thinking about that contextual point that Anne's bringing up, that I think is really valid and interesting, and not something I've thought a great deal about prior to this conversation. It's really, the question that comes to my mind is like, okay, if you're teaching an Area 1 program, like, how do you get people to focus on those positive things that are going on? When you're in an operation, how do you get them to leverage those positive things that are going on? When you're at a huge mine or a tiny guide service, right? How do we have a process that is, I think, to Anne's point, like specific to each context, but that still has that same outcome of like, these are the things that went well, let's do more of those. These are the things that didn't go well, let's do less of those, right? It's a pretty simple thing that we're trying to do, but it's really hard to get there. and especially trying to get there for a bunch of different contexts in a part of the world that has, like compared to healthcare, like has, a tiny portion of the research coming in to validate any of these approaches. And so I think, I don't necessarily have an answer there, but it does bring up some questions to me of like, how do we want a consistent thing to happen. We want to leverage positive capacities. And I think that it's pretty easy to agree upon that. And yet we have a much harder way to like actually get there, or really no roadmap to get there consistently. And especially no roadmap to get there consistently at all these different contexts. And so I don't, I guess it's, I'm sort of posing this to the rest of the panel, like, what are some of the concrete things we can do to do that a little bit better? Even if we don't have the data coming in, and because we need to do this next season in our operation or the year after that. And we don't have the time to wait for there to be like valid data that is, based on large studies and multiple large studies. Like where do we go from here, knowing that we're all kind of on board with the outcome we want, but maybe not the mechanism or the way to get there?
Gosh, question. Left everyone speechless. Yeah, I mean, I think defining our contexts can really help. And Steve mentioned this great point that there are very real constraints in place. There are capacity limitations, there are budgets, there is a shortage of time, always. And so, yeah, but really looking at what differentiates and makes a context specific that then lends itself to a different type of risk management approach, response, capacities that can be leveraged and those types of things, but maybe giving more time and focus to that defining our context piece. And also, I guess for the area instructors out there, taking time to perhaps and thinking about methods to do that with your students. How do we learn about their own contexts and what they define as too much risk and too little? And what are our methods for doing that in effective ways within our own constraints? There's a 3-day course. It's a jam-packed weekend. Yeah.
Man, one of the things that I think is much easier from an operational perspective with respect to this is like my business has a risk philosophy that is written. And we can actually look at that risk philosophy as new program types come in, like, oh, a school group wants to come, and we can actually take that and say, well, like our risk philosophy really doesn't align with this user group, like all these people that are children. Like we need to say no to this program because it doesn't align with our risk philosophy. And so I think, from an operational standpoint, as long as the operation is willing to go through that process to create a risk philosophy, a risk tolerance statement, if you want to, that's sort of the more traditional term for those things, then you at least have some sort of, context, to use your term, for making those decisions. But I think the thing that I'm struggling with is recognizing that my company has a risk philosophy. All of us that work there are pretty aligned with it and we understand it. But every single one of our guests that comes heli skiing or ski touring with us, they are all coming in with their own context. They've never sat down and thought about their personal risk philosophy. And that's an inherent push and pull in how we make this happen. I think the same thing is very true of like, if you are snowbird ski area and you hire in 10 new ski patrollers every year and hundreds of other staff, right? You may have a really great corporate risk philosophy, but how do you build that culture? And how do you, someone comes in and they're 25 years old and their personal risk tolerance is super high. Like they want to go hot lots of cliffs and get into rad terrain. How do you get them to learn, understand, and align with the organizational risk philosophy? And I think that again, like it gets back to that cultural piece. And in some small workplaces, just like, our strategic mindset worked is pretty easy to integrate into a small workplace where we all know one another and we have like an existing culture. It's much harder to like bring those pieces in the, the bigger the organization scales, or if it's coming down from the head of the mind, like you must do X, and I'm not going to explain why, right, without building that appropriate culture. So I think, it's a real challenge for a lot of organizations to do this effectively. And, I see a little bit of a microcosm in ARI programs where you're like building the culture of the program over the course of maybe just 3 days, and trying to get everyone in this program to align to some extent while they're there with a certain risk philosophy. Like, no, we're not going to go tee off today. That's not aligned with, this program that we're on right now. And what you go home and do on your own time might be different than that. And like, it is a very hard nut to crack, but I do think that we have the opportunity to like at least pique that interest and send people out. And one of the concrete examples of that is I'm often telling my Area 1 students, like, you have your ski group and you need to understand whether they are relatively aligned with your risk philosophy or way out there. And if they're way out there, that's cool. You don't have to stop being friends with those people, but you might not want to ski with them all the time just because it's gonna not feel enjoyable to you. And so really trying to, instead of framing it as like, those other people that have high risk tolerance are bad and you are good now that you've taken this Area 1, it's like you're all just on this spectrum of operational risk band or risk philosophy, however we want to describe it, or willingness to engage in certain consequences. And you want to have some alignment within your community that you're out there recreating with, to make it work for you. And I think that's a easier said than done, obviously, but I do think I've seen some of my students go on and like change their ski group contexts because they're like, ooh, I've realized that my risk tolerance, my risk philosophy was not aligned with those folks. And we're going to go have beers after our fun ski day, but we're not going to ski together. That kind of thing. That, might be possible to like just sort of like just start talking about those issues and get people to think about that as we send them off from the Area 1, maybe think about it a little bit more deeply in an Area 2 or in a professional course or in an ITC, those kind of things.
Great. Well, I'm gonna thank you all, and I think we'll still go out in the weeds, but I'm gonna pull it back in a little to answer a couple questions that have come up. I'm gonna start with the one that hasn't been addressed, and then there's another question that we've all a little bit touched on in terms of providing some concrete examples of like best practices. But I'll ask the question here. Much of this comes down to how we define operational. Implicit is being in a setting where you're responsible for the outcomes of that group. You as the parent of a pair of kids, equally as the more experienced in a group of friends, i.e. a mentor, would your approach differ, and where do we draw the line? Where would we draw the line with operational? So we've been talking about this spectrum of context, where's the line in the sand on what makes it operational?
To make it simple, you could just say it's commercial.
Mm-hmm. And maybe putting a more finer point when you're
Exchanging money for services.
Yeah, and I think that there's this whole area too, though, of like when maybe money is an exchange, but you are responsible for someone else has put the management explicitly in your hands. Maybe it's the explicit versus implicit. And I say that specifically because we have several area provider contexts in which money isn't exchanging hands, but there's definitely somebody that's the designated responsible person.
And I think that builds right on the question about best practices and drawing it back to operational best practices. That's it's easy to have a list of best practices when everybody is on the same page to start with. And, there's been tribalization and regionalization and fractionalization of the American avalanche community for, decades. And I think the National Avalanche Center is doing a really good job of trying to bring that back, back to more uniform perspective. So I think that building on, how we work with, creating new instructors and talking about mentorship and coaching and how important that is on a personal level in building your avalanche skills. On an operational level, there are, very robust operations that are very self-reflective and have taken the time and have adopted, they've looked elsewhere at other best practices and have adopted them. And there are small operations that don't have the bandwidth for it. So there's an opportunity there for operational coaching and operational mentorship that, we should encourage and we should model as, in all aspects of what we do as ARI.
And I wonder if you have, or Josh, so to summarize some of the concrete things we've talked about is, maybe they're not that concrete, they're concepts around building reflective or a self-reflective practice, having a risk mission statement, a risk philosophy. Now I'm going to call them risk mission statements. A risk philosophy. Any other ideas of maybe not, and Steve's right, like there's a lot of regional, like that's just the nature of being in the US, I think, is that there's regional flavors and tribal flavors of ways that things are done, but other practices that you would sort of lay out there as good operational best practices.
Yeah, one thing I did want to bring up is just to like set the context is that our industry does not have like formal OSHA mandates as like larger industries do. And so a lot of our practices are more like these de facto norms that gain acceptance and are borrowed from each other. There are some things scattered here and there, though, that are pretty common within our industry. For example, a release of liability form, medical forms from any client that you might take out in like guiding industries or education industries, for example. It's often pretty established practice that you have hiring terms in terms of like employees need to be a professional member of the American Avalanche Association, for example, and have a professional level training, for example. So those are some things that do commonly exist across our industry, are like liability, medical forms, standards of professional training. In terms of like the day-to-day process that we've kind of been discussing here of like, what do those communications look like? What do those reflections look like? Or anything else that it might look like. It's just kind of this ongoing conversation with our industry and ongoing evolution of what those things look like. And I think I've been trying to talk towards making that process a bit more systematic and targeted as an industry, where we actually use social science to take it apart, understand how things work, and use evidence to ground our best practices rather than this more ad hoc type of emergence and adaptation. Because it might work, but it might have some, it might fall through in some cases. So using more of an evidence-based approach than what we have been using as an industry. And one thing I can point to show like some optimism, and I don't like to speak on this with much authority because it's not really something I know well, but I do know that the relationship between research and practice has been so instrumental for our industry's learning over time. And what I can say is that my historical knowledge of this is that around the late 90s, early 2000s, there were a series of really devastating accidents. Steve, I know you could talk more to this, in which researcher Dave McClung was brought in and did a phenomenal job of outlining what our uncertainties as an industry are. And that really created a strong partnership in the courtroom that then lended itself to really well-funded research that was very applied to our industry and gave us a lot of strong foundations to work with. That then emerged to the Bruce Jameson Partnership in Canada, where he did a lot of work on so much that we know about, like shallow triggering and trigger points, and really advanced our industry way more than we can imagine in the last decade. And then finally, I do feel like this is a important point for our industry to recognize. If along those lines, if we were to be brought into the courtroom, would our industry practices hold up to where social science is? And I hope that a lot more people come to the realization that this working relationship needs to grow forward, and we need to use some of this scientific knowledge to better understand our own, and use it to get the evidence that works for us in our industry, and grow with that. So sorry for the long answer.
Thanks, Ann. Josh, did you have any other thoughts?
We're sort of trying to come up with some concrete take homes about how to manage this. I think that there are a lot of things that are that maybe are not specific in that they must occur in the same way at every workplace. But I think if you're in a workplace as an employee or as a manager, and you're not there isn't an outreach that is going on from the management to those frontline workers that allows for feedback to go both directions. To me, that's a big red flag. Right. So like if the organization is not focusing on identifying and leveraging positive capacities by talking to frontline workers and understanding what's going on, I think that that's something that needs to happen. However that will apply to your individual workplace. I think that a lot of our workplaces, particularly the larger workplaces, are really cluttered by systems that are ineffective and are complex. And one of the ways that like big take homes that I use all the time, not big take, one of the small things that I do all the time that I think really gets at that bigger issue is talking about whether the policies and procedures, whether those are formalized and like written down or whether they're just like ways of action, are they being followed or not? And it's like, if the people that are managing these organizations understanding that and asking those questions, I think that is a lack of understanding of these being able to leverage positive capacities. And ultimately, like, that's one of those very specific things. Like if you get to the end of a program that you're working in the field or wherever, that should be part of what's understood is like, are the policies and the ways of work being followed or not? And it doesn't mean that they're good or bad, but that needs to be understood, like why that is happening or not. I think that's another like very specific thing. Like I remember managing a large outdoor education organization, and one of the things we'd ask in every debrief is, did you break any policies? And you did not get fired if you broke a policy. That was okay. I just wanted to know why. Was it because you didn't know the policy? Did you not understand the policy? Or did you think the policy was stupid? Right. And, those little questions and ways of sort of looking at our work, I think can go a long way to helping us build a culture that is aligned in terms of our operational risk band, whatever you want to call that. And ultimately one that is like working together as opposed to working at cross purposes.
Thanks, Josh. Well, we are nearing the end of our time. I swear I was like, oh, how are we gonna fill an hour and a half? Should have known this group. We'd definitely take it there. So last call for any questions from the participants that are still here. And I guess not seeing those, any last thoughts from Anne, Steve, or Josh? No one wants to go because they know they'll run over 5 minutes if they get started again. Well, I want to thank the three of you so much for engaging in a wonderfully circuitous conversation in which we touched on a lot of things and I think brought up a lot of good points. I know I have several notes of threads and interesting ideas that I want to follow up on. So with that, I think maybe I'll pass this back to Brooke because I know that she has a few things to wrap this up. But again, I want to just finish by thanking Steve, Anne, and Josh. Thank you so much for taking some time to share your thoughts with us this evening.
Yeah, thanks everybody who is still sticking around. I did drop a link for feedback on this webinar or all of them, and I think it also has a question for in the future what you would like to see and learn from Erie and like continuing education. And then I am sure that if you have any lingering questions that you didn't want to ask here, you can reach out to Liz, to me, to Steve, Anne, or Josh. Not sure if you guys want to like drop in your contact to email questions if folks want to continue the conversation. And then I'm just gonna wrap it up and share a screen. Sorry, my dog's with a QR code as well. So yeah, thanks everyone. You just there's the QR code, and yeah, have a really good night. Thanks for joining during like the witching hour.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Brooke. Brooke, I don't know if you can stop the recording or if you need anything else from us. I'm sure Emma can edit the end of this off before posting it.
Let me see, I need to, yeah, I don't know how, there's still a handful of attendees, but I'm not sure how to end it without booting everybody off. So,
Well, we can also all just leave then, but I don't think that there's anything else that we need.
yeah. I can stop recording.